All right, so I'm going to show you 3 images. Ready? Now, what do all 3 of these images have in common? Well, I shot them all at completely, in my opinion, suboptimal settings. Settings so bad that if I were to see them shot from another photographer, then I would definitely question, or at least have the question in my mind as to what that person was doing. This image is a top-down shot of a garden up in the mountains, shot at 1/8000th of a second. But the subject is a landscape, and it sure as hell isn't moving anywhere. And it was shot from a stationary drone with absolutely 0 wind, so going even all the way down to 1/100th of a second would have been sufficient. This reflection image was taken using f/22, with the focus point being the bridge in the distance. However, because the bridge is so thin and the hyperfocal distance is already quite far, the depth of field is going to be well big enough to capture at most apertures. So f/22 had absolutely no business being used here and only causes more issues like image diffraction and image softness. This image is a shot of an ash cloud in the atmosphere during sunrise, which is why the light is so glowy and separated like that. It's shot at a crazy ISO 32,000, but I was using a tripod and an f/2.8 lens, giving me absolutely no reason at all to bump the ISO that far. But they all look decent enough, right? And that's because most images have an absolute myriad of different potential settings that will get the job done. And I repeat, get the job done. See, there are no perfect settings for any given photo, and every single photo has different variables to consider. Things like time of day, quality of light, artistic intention, compromises the photographer had to make, the knowledge of the technical settings that the photographer has, and on and on and on it goes. Every single photo has a myriad of decisions that led up to those settings, and looking at settings on their own with 0 context provides little value, only just assumptions. In fact, if you looked at those settings that I just showed you just then, or settings like it from another photographer, these settings would actually lead you astray from what you should be shooting like. And to reiterate, looking at the settings gives you a glimpse of the final product, but not of the decisions made before taking that photo. So there are no perfect settings for any given image because the scenarios always change. There are only decisions, and all settings require some kind of explanation for the decisions behind them. And this is why when it comes to people asking for settings when I show my images on YouTube, or they ask for settings when I post my images on Instagram or wherever else, right? I don't give it to them. I don't give out settings at all usually because they're usually of very little use, and I would rather you come up with them on your own when you look at those images for yourselves. Many people who ask are looking for them so that they can copy them. And of course, there are people out there who want those settings so that they can verify what they think the settings should be and guess whether or not they were correct enough, which is how you should be using settings in the first place. But to the ones who, just want to copy, right? That's like giving people fish rather than teaching them how to fish. Not only that, it's giving them any old fish that's available, let alone the ones that they would actually want to eat. If I were to give you the settings for a given image with no explanation of those settings, then the absolute best that someone can do with that information is to guess why I did the things that I did and understand that whether or not for them, if they were going to do it too, then at that given time of day, at that given time of year, with the exact gear setup they were using, with the exact quality of light, etc., 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 that those would have been the acceptable settings for that given situation, right? And that's the thing. Rather than asking for settings and viewing settings, the goal, in my opinion, should be to be able to look at an image and understand what settings you would have used to achieve that look that that image has. To be proficient enough with your technical settings so that it gets out of the way of the art and the message that you're trying to create. To be able to look at an image, right, and be able to say, yeah, I would have shot it with X, Y, and Z settings, but if I wanted to achieve a different look, I would have used ABC settings because this setting does this, and this setting will give it X look. To be able to look at an image of a silky sky and say, yeah, a shutter speed of maybe 5 to 10 seconds, if there's little wind, would have that effect on clouds, and I can replicate that. Or, oh yeah, there's a little bit of blur on this image because it was probably shot at X shutter speed because the subject is moving quite fast through the frame. Or, he's probably using that aperture because it's the sharpest point of that lens, and so on and so forth, and the reasons keep going. Knowing all of these things requires good fundamentals of photography and lots of practice, continually pushing yourself to learn new techniques and to understand photography in new ways until it all makes sense and it all clicks together, because eventually it will. So to backtrack, I reshot all of those images that I showed you guys at the start of the video, and these are what the images would look like with the settings that I would most likely shoot them at. And again, if you think that they look the same, that's because, again, they all still get the job done, right? So with this top-down garden shot, and by the way, all of these are still raw and not edited, but with this shot, instead of 1/8,000th of a second, my ideal settings for this shot were 1/200th of a second, because I wasn't moving around or anything and I was just still. And I also changed the aperture to f4 because that's where this lens is the sharpest for the drone that I was using, and the depth of field at that hyperfocal distance is similar. With the reflection shot, rather than shooting it at f22 and trying to drag out the shutter like I did previously, I actually put on the only ND filter I had with me, which was a 5-stop, which enabled me to shoot this at 1 second. I also used ISO 50 and f8, which settings-wise was close, but not ideal for me, as I find the most optimal sharpness for this lens I was using is 5.6, but these settings did good enough. And then finally, for the last image, rather than cranking the ISO all the way up to 32,000 and introducing a ton of grain, even though I was using a tripod, I simply prioritized f5.6 as the sharpest point in that lens, ISO 100 and 1/13th of a second for the shutter speed because I was using that tripod. And now that I've explained all of the settings to these images, know that this is just my preference. As we saw at the very start of the video, you could shoot these images with wildly different settings and still end up with something decent if your composition is good. So keep in mind that there are no perfect settings for any given scenarios. There are only just decisions, and every photo has many correct answers depending on the intention of the photographer. Your job as a photographer is to understand the exposure triangle and your gear well enough to complement that with your understanding of light, composition, and timing. Now, all of this is about mastering the craft of photography, and I bring this up because I'm actually starting something brand new, a brand new course. I'm creating a 30-day photography fundamentals bootcamp for beginner photographers who really want to get a head start on learning their craft by forming good foundations. To be able to go from absolute beginner to very well on your way to becoming a good photographer as fast as possible in just 30 days. Of course, I can't teach you absolutely everything there is to know about photography in just 30 days, but rest assured, I've carefully chosen and carefully sequenced a critical piece of photography theory for each one of those days and paired it with photo assignments for you to do so that you can put that knowledge to good use. And it'll be intense, but by the end of it, my goal is to get you to the point where you can feel confident to use any camera at any time of day, in any lighting condition, wherever you are in the world. So if you're a beginner photographer and you really want to up your photography game, then head on over to patk.com/30-day photography fundamentals and sign up to the email waitlist, where you'll be the first in line to know when it drops over the coming months. All right, that's it for this video. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope to see you in the bootcamp, and I'll see you in the next video. But until then, get out there and make something that matters. And sign up for the bootcamp. All right, peace.